Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening to you all. My name is Andrea Ayvazian. I'm a board member with Critical Connections, an organization that builds community around issues related to American Muslims and other targeted communities. On behalf of Critical Connections and all our wonderful co-sponsors, I would like to welcome you all to our discussion today on white noise, a debut documentary by The Atlantic, which gives us an inside look into the alt-right, the power of extremism, and where it is going next. Before we begin, as Meklika said, may I please request that everyone mute yourselves, and also, my friends, please limit comments in the chat until we open the floor to our Q&A. And I will now turn the program over to Meklika Samdani, our executive director, who will introduce the speakers and begin the conversation. Again, welcome.
Andrea, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Daniel Lombroso, the director of White Noise. Daniel is a director and also a journalist. Over the past 5 years, he has been a staff producer at The Atlantic and is now a senior producer with The New Yorker. I hope most of you have had a chance to see his brilliant film, White Noise, which really gives us an insights. It's a riveting film. It's also very disturbing, but it does give us incredible insights about the motivations of those leading the white supremacist movement. It gives us insights about the internal rifts that exist within the movement, and also lays bare the glaring contradictions in each of the persons that he covers during the course of the documentary. If you have not seen White Noise, it will be available for one more day at the Critical Connections website. You can access it for free, and you will have instructions if you go to criticalconnections.org or visit the Critical Connections Facebook page. You will find that it'll have instructions on how you can access the link and the film. So it is available until tomorrow. So Daniel, welcome.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for the very kind words about the film.
Absolutely. Also joining us today is Dr. Linda Tropp, who is a renowned social psychologist at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Among so many things that she researches and is an expert on, she is also an expert on white identity politics and intergroup contact and responses to prejudice and disadvantage. Welcome, Linda.
Thanks so much for having me.
And last but not least, we are joined by Tahirah Amatul Wadud, who is an attorney. She's also a civil rights advocate and an interfaith activist. Most importantly to us, she is also a Critical Connections board member. Welcome, Tahirah.
Thank you so much, Meklika.
And Linda and Tahirah are going to serve as respondents for tonight's discussion. So for the next 20 or 25 minutes, I am going to ask Daniel a series of questions, after which we will turn it over to Linda and Tahirah for their responses. And then we will open it up for Q&A. And that part of the discussion is going to be moderated by another Critical Connections board member, Samantha Camera. Okay, so without further ado, Daniel, I'm going to turn to you and ask you this. I mean, over the past 4 years, you've been covering this alt-right movement, and it could not have been easy. You are a very young journalist. You're also Jewish. Both your grandmothers are Holocaust survivors. And we would like to know how you became involved in this project, and what was it like for you personally to be steeped in an environment that was so hate-filled and so anti-Semitic for so long?
Well, it's a very difficult question, and it's one that I think about often. You know, like you said, both my grandmothers are Holocaust survivors, one from Poland, the other from Germany. My Polish grandmother is still alive, and when I brought coverage of the alt-right actually to The Atlantic. I was one of the first reporters in the newsroom to pitch a story around the group. At the time, these movements were not getting a lot of coverage. I was a little bit younger, so I was really plugged into a lot of the trends that were happening. I saw that racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as well were surging online and really coalescing behind then candidate Trump. Remember, he was one of 16 Republican candidates and then became the presidential candidate. And we really had an incomplete understanding of who the Trump voter was. I think there was a misconception that it was a working class guy from Ohio, and that's true to some extent. But being younger and having this, distinct family history, I noticed right away that really a huge section of his support were young people who were radicalized online and were really excited by this new kind of once in a generation nationalistic candidate who they called kind of as a quip, the God Emperor. That was actually the real term for President Trump at the time. I brought it to my editors and said, are we paying attention to this? Are you noticing these trends online? And they gave me permission, even at the young age of maybe 23 or 24, to, start to explore it and see what I found. One of the first stories I did was on Richard Spencer, back before he was essentially synonymous with David Duke as he is now. And during that reporting, I caught a room full of people break out into Nazi salutes. It's in the film, and you might remember 4 or 5 years ago, The Atlantic put it out as a self-contained clip. And that was a very important moment journalistically, because it really clarified that this wasn't a new edgy kind of conservatism like the conservative movement or Trump, or really the political discourse like to talk about it. It wasn't, a punk movement. It was fundamentally a neo-Nazi movement, a white nationalist movement. They were saluting Trump, in the way they would salute a fascist leader. So we put that online. Charlottesville happened about 8 months after that. And when Charlottesville happened, as I'm sure you all remember, an innocent protester was killed. We understood that this had to be a deeper investigation that gets at the psychology of the movement. So it sort of organically from there became a feature film. Was 4 years of my life across 12 states and 5 countries. And, it was a very, very difficult journey, and one that I actually felt equipped to tell because of this, really difficult and traumatic history that my family has.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Daniel, these are essentially white supremacists, right? The 3 people that you covered, the movement that you covered, they are white supremacists. But it seems as if they have tried very hard to rebrand themselves and sanitize themselves into something that they're not, and sort of trying to sort of sanitize this term white supremacy and white supremacism by calling themselves white nationalists or the alt-right. This was a phrase that was coined by Richard Spencer. What do you think this rebranding does to and how does it impact actually the mainstream conservative movement?
I think
what are the dangers surrounding that?
It's a cynical and actually a smart effort on their part to repackage really age-old ideologies, both from the legacy of the American South, but really from Richard Spencer, it's 20th century fascism. I mean, he pretty consciously, pretty openly is inspired by people like Mussolini and Hitler. Everything from his style of dress to the literary allusions he makes when he speaks. He uses the word Lügenpresse, which was a Nazi era term for basically the Jewish press. It means the lying press, but it was used to refer mostly to Jews. It's a very cynical and really a smart effort on their part to rebrand. I think it worked for some time before, like I said, the media caught up. I think the media was slow on this issue, along with a lot of issues around the Trump presidency, as I'm sure you're all familiar. And, the alt-right, like I said, got a pass. They were seen as a new kind of conservatism. Oh, those are just confused kids, or they're edgy kids. But, really they were buying into white nationalism and especially white supremacy. That being said, there is a spectrum, and I think the film does a good job of showing that. It's not to exonerate someone like a Mike Cernovich, but the point is that there's a lot of opportunists, a lot of people who racism became a commodity basically in 2016, 2017. If you want to get famous on the internet, racism became one very powerful way to get rich and famous. And there are people like Richard Spencer who believe it, all of his followers. There are also people like Mike Cernovich who attached themselves to this brand, alt-right, because it was a successful brand. And then after Charlottesville and after many of these public debacles, you see Cernovich and others try to pivot away from it. But I think it's important that we're all clear-eyed that these are all people who are concerned about preserving white power. They see the demographic shifts in this country and they're disheartened by them. And that's ultimately what this all boils down to.
Right. And, as you mentioned, and as Richard Spencer mentioned in the film, this is a young person's movement, right? Near the end of the film, however, we do see that the three leaders that you covered, well, actually, two of them are also very young, Lawrence Southern and Richard Spencer. But by the end of it, they're sort of, they've moved on to different things. They've moved on to other things for a variety of different reasons. What does the new emerging leadership look like within this movement? And who are these young people who are being attracted to it? How are they getting radicalized? And, what would you suggest would be ways to sort of prevent this thing from happening to other young folk?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I think the first thing to understand is that nationalism, white nationalism, is a deeply seductive ideology. It's almost like a drug. And when you were around, part of the making of the film was to really immerse you in that world so that you understand the seductive appeal of this movement. You'll see that there are hundreds of people filling these stadiums, commenting online. These ideas really suck you in and they make you feel like you're part of something much larger. So what Richard Spencer does well is he says, him kind of metaphorically speaking, him and all of these others, they're communicating to their followers. And Lauren Southern does this actually more effectively because she's young and well-spoken and pretty, and it's all part of a package, being a young internet celebrity. They're saying to these, confused, lost, broken kids at home, you're not, all of the issues in your life, it's not your fault, whether it's unemployment or, an existential crisis, a sense that you don't know who you are, anxiety, depression, none of that is your fault. Actually, it's the other, it's the immigrant or it's the Jew. And really you, bored white kid, you're part of this amazing historical legacy. Their real power is a narrative one. It's saying you're not just a bored kid, you're actually a descendant of a Greek, a descendant of a Roman, you take part in this amazing historical legacy. It's really romantic in a way, and it's easy to see when you're around these kids why they would be seduced into that. It makes them feel like their life has some kind of historical purpose. In a way, I don't mean to conflate, but there were a lot of middle-class kids who joined ISIS, for example, and that was always perplexing to people in Europe. Why would a middle-class bus driver in East London join the Islamic State?
Right.
And oftentimes it was that same thing, that they could take part in something larger that was better than their mundane day-to-day experience. And when you talk to these kids, you hear that again and again and again, that of course they believe it, but they feel for the first time like their life has some meaning. So I think, if you have that understanding as your starting point, you have to say, okay, how do I de-radicalize someone who's been intoxicated by this? And, I think these are irreprehensible ideologies. Everyone who takes part in them has to be, held accountable if they create violence. But it also has to begin with understanding. If someone is being sucked down a rabbit hole because it's providing a community, a group identity, I think we have to find a way to provide a group identity to those kids in a different way, not exonerating them at all, but there has to be an off-ramp for these people, much in the way that there's an off-ramp for drug addicts. If you do heroin, you can't quit cold turkey. There has to be a way. And these kids are deeply corrupted, but there's many of them, thousands of them, I would say, in all mainstream cities, at universities. And, it's a big, big problem on our hand. It's a ticking time bomb. And I think we have to have hard conversations about how we rehabilitate these individuals.
Absolutely. I remember a few years ago, Critical Connections and Karuna Center for Peace Building, we hosted an event with somebody who was part of a neo-Nazi group, a former member of a neo-Nazi group. And he said what attracted him to that group when he was 14 was that it provided a sense of identity, a sense of community, and a sense of purpose. Yeah. And because that community, those hidden spaces of hate, as they're called, because they're able to do all of those things, and like you said, provide meaning to these young kids, there is such a sort of seductive power to that. And
Exactly.
All right. So, in a recent Boston Globe article, you wrote that as you were covering this movement, you knew that this would lead to armed insurrection. And I'm wondering what about that? What were your insights that you gleaned while covering it that led you to believe that?
I think it's important to understand that this is fundamentally a violent movement. The group is concerned with the preservation of white power in America. This country is 63% white. 20 years from now, the Census Bureau predicts that the country will become majority minorities, right? The only way to preserve that reality is ethnic cleansing, it's mass deportations. It's the sort of thing that we saw on January 6th. And I think it's really important to be clear-eyed that, if we're talking about the preservation of white power, it inevitably leads to dramatic and violent events. I could have never predicted that the Capitol building would be stormed by hundreds of radicals in the way that it was. But we saw the footprints, we saw the clues to this all over the world. I mean, we saw a massacre in New Zealand 2 years ago at a mosque, right? We saw a shooting at a synagogue where 12 elderly Jews were killed when they were praying. We saw an effort to target Mexicans at a Walmart in Texas. This is a movement that is willing to do anything it needs to do to preserve white demographic power in the United States and by extension in Western Europe. The thing that makes me optimistic, and I don't mean to be jumping ahead, is that, you know, millions of Americans have bought into multiculturalism. They believe this is an immigrant nation and that we all have a right to be here. You know, it's my personal belief that not now, but in 2 or 3 decades from now, it'll be too little too late for these groups, that the war is over in a way and that this is the last gasp. But I think it's going to be a very, very violent and difficult last gasp, because, you know, the America of their quote unquote forefathers, you know, John Wayne on a horse, the kind of cowboy iconography, that's becoming a thing of the past. And, you know, any notion that this is a white man's country, of course, is problematic. The only people who could say that potentially are the Native Americans, right? But many, many people in this country have that notion, whether it's subconscious or conscious. And it's something that we're going to have to deal with when we you know, move more and more towards a multicultural future.
Sure. I mean, how do you think the events of January 6th impacted this movement? You know, there was a massive crackdown against it. Hundreds have been arrested and charged, those people who had, you know, stormed the Capitol. Do you think this is going to still, I mean, because of the sensationalism around that raid, I mean, do you think that that's going to energize the movement, or is it going to, or is the, you know, the response from law enforcement going to dampen it?
It's a difficult question as well. You know, I think the group is mostly deflated at this point, but that doesn't mean it's going anywhere. You know, I think what's happening is that there's been a delayed response. I was lucky enough to have the privilege to cover this early. Most of the country didn't care and wasn't paying attention. I'm sure Critical Connections was, because you seem like a fantastic nonprofit, but, you know, I'm sorry if I'm taking a roundabout answer here, but we were pitching white noise around in 2016 and 2017. Hey, give us money. This is important journalism. Someone needs to document this movement. And everyone says this is going to go away. It's not an issue. This is before the shootings I mentioned. A year later, they said, you know, we have this film White Noise. Look at the footage at this point. It's amazing. Look at these individuals, you know, program it in your festival, whatever, you know, pick it up for distribution. And people said, oh, this is going to go away when Trump loses. And then January 6th happened. And I think we have to understand that I don't mean to be dramatic, but the fascist impulse is eternal, that these ideas have risen again and are now part of our political discourse. And we live in a social media environment where something that's radical is much more likely to go viral than something that is banal or moderate or mainstream. I mean, the algorithms really privilege the sort of work that Lauren and Mike are doing and not the kind of work that I'm doing, sensitive portraits, right? All of that being said, that was such a public debacle for the movement. And, you know, it looked so bad. You know, the FBI is paying attention now. Everyone is paying attention. There are hearings in Congress. The social media giants are finally starting to crack down. It's becoming harder for them to fundraise. So many of the trends that should have started back when I was, you know, banging on doors 3 or 4 years ago have finally started. That doesn't mean it's going away, but it is making it a lot harder for them to operate.
Yeah, and you're talking about 3 and 4 years. I remember we also had somebody on Critical Connections who was part of the Department of Homeland Security, and he was actually researching and monitoring these right-wing groups back in 2008. Yeah. And there was a unit within DHS that actually came out with a very extensive report saying that this is where the threat is. And because there was so much backlash from conservative media types and policymakers, that they not only did not made public that report, but also disbanded that particular unit. So, you know, there is perhaps hope now, given all of the, you know, the events of January 6th and everything that led up to it, that there is now more of a focus. And as you know, so I guess my last question to you, Daniel, is, you know, these groups were absolutely emboldened under the Trump administration. Are you encouraged by what you're seeing within the Biden administration in terms of how they're responding to it? And do you think that the crackdown will continue?
I am encouraged. Merrick Garland is looking like he'll be the Attorney General, right? And he said right away that this is a priority for him to focus on white domestic terrorism. Mm-hmm. The whole language of the way we talk about this issue has changed. That, you know, this isn't the Trump voter. It's not the white working class. This is an issue of white domestic terrorism. It's an imminent threat to our institutions, to our way of life. I think the administration is taking it a lot more seriously. It appears that they're putting initial resources towards, stopping that effort, as you mentioned. And in the Trump administration, everyone was reassigned basically to covering Islamic fundamentalism, which, is becoming less of a threat every year and has very clearly been eclipsed by white domestic terrorism. If you look at maps of terrorist attacks worldwide, there have been hundreds of attacks across the US and Europe by white domestic terrorists over the past 5 or 6 years. Many of them smaller, many of them, hate crimes, but it's really it's a clear thing that we're battling. And I think the tone and tenor of this administration is a lot more clear. They're clear-eyed about it. I think, I'm a little bit skeptical of giving the government too much power to crack down on terrorism, because we saw actually with the issue of Islamic terrorism and the Bush administration, it can lead to unintended consequences where it allows for surveillance and a lot of other issues. So it's a little bit trickier than just, go hard on these guys. But I am encouraged initially by what I'm seeing.
Excellent. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for those insights. I'm sure we'll have so many more questions,
Great.
From our audience in the later part of the discussion. For now, I'm going to turn to Dr. Linda Tropp. And Linda, in 2018, there was a research study done by Professor George Hawley at the University of Alabama, and he found that 5.6% of the non-Hispanic white population shared the worldview of the alt-right, especially when it came to issues of white identity, the need for white solidarity, and issues around white victimization. Could you talk a little bit about this broader interest in white identity in the 11 million people that 5.6% of the population translates into, and also anything else that you would like to respond to in response to the film, and also what Daniel said?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Malika. And just first, I really do want to commend Daniel on this film, and also the comments that you just offered. I suspect you might see some resonance in some of the things that I have to say in response to Malika's question. When I think about this, I think that, until fairly recently in our nation's history, most white people in the United States probably didn't have that much to say or have had much thought related to race. In fact, I'd say most white Americans on a day-to-day basis wouldn't really think about themselves as white. It's not very salient in the minds of most white people on a day-to-day basis until recently. And I think part of what's changed is in part the media coverage talking about these changing demographics of the United States that Daniel also spoke about, how white people will no longer represent the majority of the US population by somewhere around 2042, 2045, you hear different estimates. And I think also part of whites' growing awareness or consciousness of their whiteness has also been due in part to the efforts of a lot of people, and I'd say particularly people of color, who have really been very vocal in advocating for social change to address ongoing racial disparities in so many aspects of our society, from the criminal justice system to education to healthcare and so on.
Linda, if I could just ask you to speak a little louder. We had a request from the audience. If you could speak a little louder, please.
Absolutely. I apologize. So when we think about these dual influences, that on the one hand, white people through media coverage in some degree have become aware of the fact that there are changing demographics in the United States, so that whites will become a minority population within the US as a whole. Probably a plurality is a better way to frame it, I think. And also thinking about that people of color have been very vocal in advocating for social change to address racial disparities in many different aspects of our society. Unfortunately, what I think often happens is that when people of color highlight the need for real social change and appear to be making progress toward either swaying the general population or legislators in enacting real transformative social change, a lot of white people feel threatened. So I think very much along the lines of what Daniel was saying, there's kind of a fear of that change. And I think also depending on who they are or what their political orientations are, they might feel threatened in a variety of ways. So for example, not referring to the alt-right white community, but, among white liberals, one of our biggest fears or is, the threat of being perceived as racist or not being a good ally, right? Those are the things that keep us up at night. Like, oh, did I say the wrong thing? But in the case of white people who are on the more conservative side of the spectrum, and particularly folks in the alt-right community, I would say that this feeling of threat really has a lot to do with threats related to white status in society and the sense of status loss. I think generally a lot of white people have felt that being white meant something, that it helped people to feel important or like valued members of society, whether explicit or implicit, that US society was built for them. And now I think they fear becoming irrelevant. And I think Daniel's film really demonstrated that and illustrated that so well, whether we're thinking about the chants at Charlottesville of "You will not replace us," to thinking about, hearing examples of Richard Spencer's rhetoric where he talks about being demeaned for being white, or telling white people that they'll be displaced, or, Mike Cernovich referring to diversity as a form of white genocide. I think all of these are verbal expressions of that fear of losing status, of losing the perceived importance to the identity of what it means to be an American. And there's often been this conflation between what it means to be an American and what it means to be white. And I think that also relates to something that you and Daniel were speaking to in relation to youth, that in particular, as Daniel said, that these ideas make you want to feel like you're part of something. And I too was thinking about that other Critical Connections Karuna Center event with, I believe it was Christian Piccolini, who talked about this sense of identity, the sense of purpose, that sense of belonging that you really got from joining this white power group. If I could, I don't know how much time I have, but I'd love to mention.
You have time. Please go ahead.
I'd love to mention just a couple more quick
Please
things.
do.
Another thing that really struck me about the film was how often you saw folks in the alt-right movement referring to diversity or race relations as like a zero-sum, not really a game, but a zero-sum war. Richard Spencer really referred to it as a war, like conflict. And there is research to suggest that white people in particular are likely to have these zero-sum perceptions of diversity and race relations relative to members of other groups. And this is actually related to some work that I've been doing with a colleague at New York University, Eric Knowles. He and I have recently done some research to suggest that many white people have this idea of minority collusion, that all these non-white communities, members of different racial and ethnic minority groups, are essentially colluding together to displace white people. Now, if you asked many members of racial and ethnic minority groups or non-white communities in the US, they'd say, well, we want more rights, but we're not like, all part of this cabal with other groups trying to figure out how we can displace whites. Like, that's not what we're doing. We're advocating for a more multicultural society. But I think that zero-sum thinking that is in the minds of a lot of white people, and particularly those who feel threatened, leads them to then in turn, in their minds, as a defensive tactic or strategy, to endorse white identity politics, to say, well, if we're being displaced by all these other people, then just like these racial and ethnic minority groups might vote in favor of their social and political interests, that it's now come time for white people to do the same. So I think that's in some ways, how we can think about the psychology of what's going on with white people who feel threatened by diversity. And I think it can often be hard for us to understand if we don't share those views, how many white people might feel that way, especially for those of us who might see that the US was really built on white supremacy and has predominantly benefited white people. It might be hard to understand where they're coming from. And, I think many might even be tempted to ridicule people who feel this way. But if we think about it psychologically, that what they're contending with is this fear, a real sense of threat from their perspective of being left out or being left behind, then we have to think about how we're going to respond to that. And I think ridicule would just push them farther afield. Instead, feeling heard and included might help to disarm some of that vitriol. And in particular, it makes me think about some research by a colleague of mine at UC Berkeley who's studied multiculturalism and like, how can we try to get whites on board with multiculturalism? And what she's found is that initially, a lot of white people think that when you talk about multiculturalism, you mean like all other racial and ethnic and cultural groups except for white ones. Again, that zero-sum framing. So if you kind of hit white people over the head with the idea that actually multiculturalism includes you too, then they're like, oh, okay, that's not so bad. So I think these issues of belonging and inclusion and the threats to feeling, discarded or no longer valued are really, really crucial for us to take into account.
Wow, that's excellent, Linda. I'm sure there'll be so many follow-up questions to the fascinating research that you've done. It's very, very insightful. I'm now going to turn to Tahirah. Tahirah, you are part of an African-American Muslim community in upstate New York called Islamburg. It's a beautiful Muslim enclave. And that community has been repeatedly targeted by white supremacists. Thankfully, none of the plots that they had planned materialized because they were thwarted by law enforcement just in time. But I'm wondering what it is like for you and for the Islamburg community, especially in this moment when we see a resurgence of right-wing extremism. What is the threat that you're feeling, that the community is feeling? And what are gaps in laws or policies around domestic terrorism that you feel the Biden administration should address?
Thank you for that question. It's very interesting because the conversations that we're having as a community these days, honestly, I told you so. That's exactly what the conversations are. That's what our chat rooms look like. That's what our telephone calls are sounding like. We've been saying this forever. What are we talking about? We're talking about the Capitol, the insurrection at the Capitol. We said, we know those people. We know some of those names are familiar. We've had to fight those people off from coming to our community because at some point, someone became fixated on families minding their business, living in the woods, now became a fixation of the right-wing domestic terror groups who are wholly discontent with their own existence. And we've been fighting them. I often say that Tahirah and I, both lawyers for the community of Islamburg, that we've been quietly fighting these people since 2007. And we know that 2007 was a turning point because there was an uptick in hate crimes and particularly anti-Muslim, anti-Black hate crimes. And that was because of the election and the campaign of President Obama. And that is, again, when these folks are working, and it's quite coordinated, it's a campaign, it's well-funded, they are working. These are not just individuals that are sitting at their computers and just randomly thinking. They are driven. This is an ideology, and it has a huge following. It's a misnomer to just dismiss that these people are very dedicated to the art of violence and of hate. But we didn't even realize what we were up against. We thought it was a couple of episodes of the 700 Club, a couple of episodes of Fox News. But when we dug, because we actually ended up filing a lawsuit against some bloggers who caused lots of havoc and radicalized folks, we talked about filing a lawsuit against Fox News. And ultimately, because we said so, we told you so, when plots started to emerge and were thankfully intercepted, and that's plots plural, when they did start to emerge, but they were intercepted and disrupted, we said, we told you this was coming, that these words will have meaning and people will act upon them, which is why we were just one stop on this path of white supremacist violence, which I think now the world grapples with on the heels of the insurrection. So how does the community feel now? We feel like we struck back very hard. We showed white supremacists that we will not take their threats lying down. We showed law enforcement that we will not take white supremacist threats lightly, and we would not take it lying down. Both of those things are important to say because anti-Black violence has existed since and before the inception of this country. Massacres of Black people have existed for years. For years, you think of Black Wall Street, you think of a massacre in 1917 in East St. Louis. You think of there's another massacre that occurred called the People's Grocery. And what is common about those things, and there are many examples of this, is that when African Americans begin to accomplish some autonomy, some wealth, some coming onto their own, white supremacists cannot tolerate it. And they strike out and attempt to destroy. So what happened with Islamberg, and this was really happening between 2015, just as recently as 2019, there was a disrupted plot, like real plots that were very scary where the FBI was involved, is quite in line for what this country has experienced and what it does. I want to talk about something that Linda said, which is that when you talk about allyship and what to do, I also want to make space and give air to a reality that we often assuage white fragility. Often. That even as we were the victims of a plot where this man said he wanted to use a machete to kill the children who will be collateral damage, and that is on the FBI recording. So let's just say that this is what this man said he would do. As we attempted to tell our story and to garner attention, because this was relatively resolved on a hush-hush basis, because we give cover to white supremacy violence. And the FBI asked us to keep it a little quiet while we resolve this through a settlement, a plea deal. But I realized that even as a community, as we attempted to gather allies and to tell our story and to get the media to pay attention to what was happening, and again, I am talking specifically about the Islamberg plot, and one in particular, we had to use words that would draw allies to us and not alienate us. So we couldn't say white supremacists because people are thinking white supremacists wear hoods. We knew that it would be alienating to the white allies that we needed to come on board, because honestly, white allies give credibility to movements. We could not use certain words, and we knew this subconsciously. This wasn't we weren't sitting there thinking, oh, let's use this word. And so we had to speak about it as Islamophobia, as anti-Black violence, as anti-Black hatred. We could not call it white supremacist violence because the country wasn't ready for that at that time. So even in your victimhood, you're still assuaging to the fragility of people who may not be ready for that dialogue. Again, it's not a criticism. I'm glad that I'm able to sit here in 2021 and have this discussion with you all, because in 2015, when we were dealing with it, not only was it raw and painful, and we were in the middle of trauma, we were also managing our relationships with our white and non-Muslim and Muslim allies in a way that would hopefully make them comfortable linking arms with us. That is beyond fascinating. And it is a perspective that I did not have while we were in the throes of it, but one that I can sit back now these years later and say, oh, shoot, that's wild. That is wild. Am I talking too much?
Absolutely not. We need to hear more.
Do you want me to keep going, or do you want, what do you want? How do you want me to share thoughts now?
You can continue to talk about this, Tahirah, or you can sort of also talk about, do you feel that we are in a slightly different moment from what you just described, what happened a few years earlier and how you had to be so careful about even the language that you employed? Do you feel like we're moving towards a moment, given, again, I don't want to bring, everything back to January 6th, but I feel like there was a somewhat of a national shift that took place around that day. And I'm wondering whether you think there'd be a different environment.
I think there was, and I want to also say that in watching the documentary, the world is small. People, anti-racist is a small community. Racists are a small community, and so I met Heather Heyer's mother a couple of years ago at a conference, so to speak, of people who had been the victims of hate crimes, and so I'm seeing her name and her tragic death in the documentary brought back those memories. I will say that watching the documentary was triggering. It was traumatic. These conversations they are also necessary. So just because they're uncomfortable, triggering, traumatic, doesn't mean you don't have them. I am reminding myself that it is okay to feel kind of yucky about revisiting some of this, but that it's necessary because we have to educate. Are we in a different moment? I think that Heather Heyer's death was a turning point to some extent. And I think for sure the Capitol Hill insurrection is a turning point. What I also think is interesting is that now the cat's out the bag, right? Now we can talk about white supremacy and not feel like, oh, that's not polite discussion in public. But I'm also equally concerned that just like the woman in the documentary said, oh, I'm tired of hearing the word racist, that's so worn out. I'm also concerned that we may get too comfortable with the word white supremacy, that we may get too comfortable with words like white privilege, and that sometimes being shocked into new labels becomes necessary to keep people uncomfortable and on their toes. And so at this point, I'm not really loving conversations about white privilege, because now everybody's like, yeah, I know, that's white privilege. No. I want to say, no, that's a white supremacist construct. Like, let that sit with you for a minute. That's a white supremacist construct. If that's your white privilege, I'm glad you're calling yourself on it, but it's no longer cute. It's no longer something that happened to you. I'm glad you're woke, but we need to be more uncomfortable than to just say, yes, that's white privilege and I want to do better. I want to hear that is what I am engaging in a white supremacist construct, because that hurts. That hurts for anybody to utter, to think, to say, and to acknowledge. So again, we're talking about the use of words and phrases and where we are going. Our lives are happening and changing and evolving so fast now that even words become old in a matter of 18 months. But this is where we are, and we have to keep up if we're going to continue to have truthful, transparent conversations around uncomfortable things.
Hear, hear. Thank you for that, Tahirah. I'm sure people have lots of questions for all three of you, but I'm now going to turn it over to Sam Camera to sort of begin that Q&A. So over to you, Sam.
Oh, Tahirah, thank you. Thank you all. I feel so lucky to be here. So I just want to thank Tahirah and Linda and Daniel and Melika for gathering us. So it's time for question and answer. I would like you to write your questions in the chat because I think that will save time. I think it's also important to articulate who your question is for, so we're not, playing the guessing game. So if you could do that, that would be excellent, and I will read them. I will get to as many of them as we possibly can. I can imagine us, this could go till midnight, but we're not going to do that. People need to get their rest. So thank you again, and let's begin. I have a question for Dr. Tropp. I only recently learned about Tajfel's studies that concluded that group members are motivated to act to the detriment of outgroups, even if there is no benefit to the in-group. I wonder if this is consistent with research you have done or are familiar with, and any opinions you have about this.
Oh gosh, that is a semester-long question. I'll try to be brief. So Tajfel is very well known for a whole area of research called social identity theory. What he basically proposed is that even in the absence of overt conflict between groups, simply categorizing people as members of different groups and making that group membership salient, or that difference between groups salient, that would promote in-group favoritism, a tendency to favor members of our own groups over members of other groups. Yes, there's a lot that can be said about that basic category distinction that fosters intergroup bias, as we would call it. But Tajfel's research and other people since have actually clarified that the motivation behind it is usually to boost our own group identity, not necessarily to put down other groups, but to feel good about who we are. So there have been many other theories of prejudice or explanatory mechanisms to explain that kind of focus on derogating other groups. And a lot of those have to do with threat, kind of in relation to some of the themes that I spoke about. Feeling displaced, feeling that other people are threatening your access to resources or the potential to support your own livelihood, threats associated with seeing a change in society or things that are changing your way of life in ways that you don't like. Any combination of those, whether it's an identity threat, resource threat, kind of a symbolic threat associated with values, any of those can contribute to a greater tendency to favor our own groups and derogate other groups. So I'll leave it there for others to ask questions.
Thank you. So this is for any panelist. How can we get in front of these young people before they get radicalized by the far-right racists?
I can start briefly. You know, I think to Linda's point, we need an inclusive narrative around multiculturalism. I think so much of this is about the perceived loss of status, this idea that America, at least implicitly, is a white man's country. And to Tahirah's point, it's something that, you know, people of color have understood in this country for decades and we weren't listening to. You know, I think we have to, from a very young age, in the education system, instill a narrative around multiculturalism that shows that it's really not threatening to white identity. It's not a zero-sum game, that all of us, you know, are learning from each other, that we benefit from one another's presence, that this is fundamentally an immigrant nation. And, you know, we all learn that in a superficial way, learning about Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, but, you know, we don't really have hard conversations about immigrant groups and what demographics mean. And I think we need both, you know, images that show a positive multiculturalism, and also kind of a new, I guess it sounds cheesy, but a new American story, that this is a country that was, you know, founded on the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, that we brought hundreds of thousands of people here on slave ships. You know, we had Jim Crow and eventually emancipation of African Americans. It's obviously an incomplete thing, and that we're now building towards a new country where hopefully, you know, it's incomplete, but that everyone is sharing, that it's both equality and equity. And I think, you know, we need to, I think from a very young age, instill a narrative where everyone understands that they have a role and it's an equal role in this country. And I think Linda spoke to the kind of implicit understanding that this is a white man's country, and a lot of white people, I think, grow up with that, whether they recognize it or not. And it's, I think it's our job as educators to kind of to teach against that from a very young age, and show that you know, everyone, this is one of the few countries, it's a historical experiment. It's one of the first countries in the world to be an immigrant nation. And I think, you know, we should cherish that from a very young age.
Great, thank you. This next question is also for you, Daniel. Did you participate in these groups as an undercover person? And if so, did you feel threatened about discovery?
Sorry, I'm getting two in a row, guys. Never undercover. Journalistic ethics are very important both to me and to The Atlantic. So we treated this with the journalistic rigor of a cover story. So everything went through a rigorous fact check and a legal review, went through dozens of edits. I never misrepresented myself as a journalist or as someone of Jewish heritage. So someone asked, on one very brief anecdote is Richard Spencer asked for more about my Italian ancestry on one shoot because my last name seems Italian. We actually changed it 100 years ago. And, I felt, in that moment that it might compromise my access, but I always wanted to be truthful. So I said, actually I'm Jewish. Both my grandmothers are Holocaust survivors. Like, sorry, Richard, but I'm not the Italian reporter friend that you thought I was. And, I think in a way that actually led to better and more genuine footage. I think, the thing that really defines white noise is the intimacy and the kind of inability to reconcile. They're all struggling with cognitive dissonance. They're unable to reconcile very clear contradictions. Things that are abundantly obvious to everyone else are not obvious to them. And the way I really achieved that over months and years was to be very straightforward about my reporting process, very straightforward about my intentions, and to really push back when I needed to. If I infiltrated, it might have made a very cool kind of meta film about the Jew who infiltrated the alt-right, but it was ultimately about the perpetrators. It's about them and their psychology. So I felt that the best way to get them to be honest was to be honest with them.
Great. This question is for Tahirah. What are your thoughts about how a Republican Congress in 2 years or another Trump presidency could influence in white supremacist terrorist movement?
Oh, my hope is that we won't see that. I mean, political stuff aside and party stuff aside, my hope is that as a country, we're going to do better regardless of who is in the majority in the House or who's in the White House. And I hope that I'm not being naive in that regard, but I just feel like we've made great strides, great sacrifices, endured lots of pain. And I'm hopeful that means something, and that this is the beginning of a more fair, a more thoughtful coexistence. And maybe I'm naive, but I really hope and pray that we've experienced the worst of it. That's what I hope.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This one I think could be for anyone, but how important is the mainstream media such as Fox in stoking the alt-right?
Oh, may I please? May I please?
Yes, say
so,
it.
It's very important. It is a huge influence, but it's not the only influence, but it is a huge influence on individuals who have become radicalized. I can't underestimate enough how much that is a true statement. In fact, like I said, we sued one organization and we started drafting a complaint against Fox News. Okay, that's how frustrated and fed up we were. That I will also tell you that in the case that we talked about with Islamberg, the Doggett case, there were a couple. So Doggett in particular was sentenced to 20 years for his plot to burn the mosque, kill the children with machetes. He essentially references something that he heard on Fox News in his pitch to gather supporters. His defense attorneys also, in making a pitch for sentencing, I think they also referenced Fox News as, well, who could blame him when even Fox News is saying it? So Fox has made its way, it's brought itself into culpability, and that's very unfortunate. Someone had asked, how do we get ahead of radicalizing people? You got work to do, right? You have work to do. You have to speak truth. You have to push for education, just basic education, like Daniel said. We've been brainwashed into a form of American history that doesn't exist because it's not true. There are so many things about the history of this country that I am only learning as an adult. And that's not because I was ignorant or my parents were ignorant. A lot of it is because it has been suppressed. There's an article in the New York Times last year. I'll this article will live with me forever. It talks about Houghton Mifflin, the big textbook manufacturer, issues a 5th grade textbook. They're great books, great quality. But if you live in Texas, your textbook is going to say one thing about the Civil War or the Harlem Renaissance. If you live in California, it's going to say something different. And if you live in New York, it's going to say something different. So when you talk about education, you're even talking about basic education that is being denied today to our students. When we hear about school committees and school boards saying we're not going to teach Black history, what's happening is you're going to continue to perpetuate a lack of information, a lack of knowledge, and what is in those gaps, what is it filled with? Myths, false information, radicalization. We have to get our people. This right here, we already saw a recipe for disaster.
If I could, I'd love to add just a
Yes,
touch
please.
to what Tahirah was saying. I absolutely agree. And, you know, a lot of this makes me think, you know, I think for those of us on the left or who lean left politically, it's very easy to just kind of blame Fox News. But I would even go like farther back than that and, you know, remember that we used to have a fairness doctrine in public broadcast journalism, you know, and it can't be the same. You know, we now have cable news, we have social media, but to really think about, you know, why not have some sort of expectation that news being reported is truthful and have a similar type of fairness doctrine in terms of what is included in our textbooks? I don't think it should become so relativist. I know relativism has often been used as a term to kind of critique the left, but I think, you know, we need to have some basic shared understandings and facts in order to live in a shared society. And I think as part of that, not necessarily saying that we need to have the same shared narrative. So we need to have some basic shared information, but perhaps we might have different narratives about how different sets of people or generations or populations experience those moments in history. I mean, what I was hoping so much is after so many of these Confederate statues were taken down is that they would do like what's been done in like many post-Soviet countries where there's kind of like a historical park where you can go and learn about why they were constructed, what they represented, have plaques representing both sides about how they were interpreted. I'm also thinking about how, you know, how we are taught about slavery and the history of enslaved people in the United States. I have to be honest, it wasn't until I read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns that I really started to think about the Black migration. And I grew up in industrial steel town in the Midwest, but to really think about the Black migration as refugee migration in the way that we think about so many other refugee communities. And so I want to save time for other questions, but I think it's really important for us to just really, as a country, face how we share information and what we expect from the information that is shared.
One very quick point on Fox.
Yes, please.
Fox is the way that these ideas are injected into the bloodstream of American politics. I know it sounds like a dramatic way to say it, but you know, these figures on the far right know what they're doing. They're really moving the discourse as far to the right as they possibly can. It's called moving the Overton window in political science. They're moving things. They're opening the window of what's possible in political discourse. And you know, you see it. They're very cynical and they're very smart at doing that. You know, Mike Cernovich comes to mind in the film. He created the hashtag Sick Hillary, the idea that Hillary had Parkinson's. He was able to, again, inject that into the mainstream conversation. 2 days later, it was on Sean Hannity's show. And a day after that, it was coming out of the president's mouth. I mean, those things happen again and again. Tucker Carlson is now the one of the most high traffic shows on cable news. He's making very clear dog whistles to white nationalism. He's saying things that Richard Spencer was telling me 4 or 5 years ago. So, you know, it's not necessarily that Fox News is explicitly white nationalist, but they're winking to their audience in a way that I think over time, you know, weighs on the viewer, makes them feel sympathetic to a lot of these issues. And it's really a gateway drug into the more extreme stuff that I covered.
Daniel, can you tell us how you got the three main people in your film to be so unguarded in some of your interviews?
I'm young and I smile a lot, I think. No, I don't. I think it's it was just months, really years of persistence. I mean, I had the privilege of having an amazing legacy brand behind me that was founded in 1857 before the Civil War. It's not an explicitly political. The Atlantic is political, but it doesn't carry the baggage of a New York Times or a CNN. I know that sounds weird, but if I said I was, from CNN, they probably wouldn't have talked to me. So I had a little bit of coverage. And then I think, I just really built these deep personal relationships with the individuals. I find their views deeply reprehensible, personally threatening because of my family's history and threatening to my vision for this country. But, I think they saw that I was sincere in wanting to understand who they were. And Spencer was a little bit easier. Cernovich took a few months. His wife took even longer. And Lauren took close to a year, I think 9 or 10 months to convince her to be in the film. And it was only when she invited me to Russia, which is only 3 minutes in the film, but I spent 10 days in Russia with her, eating together, talking, really getting to know each other. And like I said, I was just an open book to them. I was honest with them. Only then did, it was a give and take. Only then would she start to open up about a lot of the, I think, really key themes in the film around sexual harassment and, how deeply misogynistic this movement is. It was kind of the honesty and the persistence just gave them the space to feel that they could do it. The last thing I'll add very quickly is a lot of documentary productions are bigger. They're working with, cameramen and crews and sound. This film never had any budget. The Atlantic was willing to pay me my meager salary and let me do my thing. And in a way that created an intimacy because it was just me and my camera, no one else. And, they just felt like they were talking to me. They knew they were on camera. They knew they were on the record, of course, but they were looking at me, and the things they said to me, of course, were broadcasted to the rest of the world eventually. But it was intimate in the moment, and that's why it's intimate in the film.
Wow, thank you for that. This question's for Tahirah. With Merrick Garland as AG, can you imagine, do you think likely a change in practice by the FBI to not keep quiet the detection of derailing of current future white supremacist violence? Nice light question.
We know, and I learned, again, these are not things that you pick up without, unfortunately, having some lived experience, that administrations matter, administrative priorities matter, and advocacy matters. So it is my hope that the Biden administration will prioritize the prosecution of hate crimes, that U.S. attorneys throughout the country aggressively prosecute hate crimes and name them as hate crimes, that our local district attorneys do the same. There's so much power and discretion had by local U.S. attorneys and district attorneys, and in terms of what they can do. And the same is for the U.S. attorney. You'd be surprised how much discretion there is in terms of what you call things. But words matter, labels matter, titles matter, and the seriousness by which they are prosecuted matters. It matters to the victims, and it sends strong warnings to those who are inclined to go that road. I know that that Mehika and I had talked a bit before tonight about talking about the words domestic terror and what that means, and whether this is a time where we should be thinking about a different legislative construct. Because for our viewers today, I will share with you that it was confusing for us in 2015 as we were dealing with what we described as domestic terrorists, to realize that there really is no such animal called a domestic terror charge. That's not a mechanism, that's not a vehicle. And so what that means is that if there is a connection to international actors, and we know who that was designed to reach, then there's a terrorism charge. That's a federal charge that can be affixed and charged and prosecuted with its own punishment. But there is nothing called a domestic terror charge, meaning that if you're engaging in terrorism, and it has a definition of violence, threats of violence designed to influence the civilian population, like I almost know it by heart, that if it's domestic only, meaning within the confines of our country without an international actor, there's no such equivalent charge. There's no such equivalent punishment. So if you're going to massacre children and burn down their mosque, it sounds terroristic to me, but you will be charged with attempted murder and burning a religious place of existence, but you won't be charged with domestic terror because it's not a thing. And so often people have been asking, well, what do you think about the creation of a domestic terror charge? Well, we know that terrorism and the whole construct around the Patriot Act followed 9/11, and it was all geared towards Muslims and those identifying as Muslims. It was all geared towards responding to 9/11 and the tragedy that existed. That said, there is purposely no domestic terror, I believe, and others believe, because that would, of course, encapsulate the KKK and all of these other groups. Those are the good old boys. Those are people who are interconnected with these, we're now finding out, arms of various law enforcement agencies, military people in authority. And so it's not, there's no inadvertence that domestic terror was left off. That said, people have asked me, do you have an opinion about whether this is the time to push for and advocate for a domestic terror charge? And I will say that while we were fighting for Islamberg and calling out the hypocrisy, we kept saying, call him a domestic terrorist, call them domestic terror. There should be a domestic terror charge because the hypocrisy was astounding. But with some passage of time, with my own evolution as a lawyer and as someone who ran for office and being able to understand legislative creation, I'm still right now without an opinion, or it's inconclusive in my mind as to whether a domestic terror charge, the creation of that, is something that's necessary for our country. Part of that reason that the jury is still out is because we know that these sorts of legislative provisions often come back to hurt Black and Brown people in ways that you didn't really imagine that they would. And I'm just thinking about whether there's a better way to accomplish a similar goal. And so that's a conversation that my ears are so wide open on listening to and having that debate about. But it's no longer us in 2015 saying there should be a domestic terror charge. More so, that rally cry was to call out the hypocrisy. But I think it's a great conversation to have, and people are educated and aware now of this, because it was very murky before.
Thank you, Tahirah. Thank you so much. I just want to jump in for a second. We have more than 40 more questions. We are, however, running out of time. I just want to ask our panelists if they are willing to go until 8:30, perhaps, if that is okay. We won't be able to get to all 44 questions. However, we'll try and get to as many as possible. So thank you all so much.
This one is for Daniel, but it could be anyone that wants to answer it. How do you find the balance between exposing these groups and giving them publicity?
It's a difficult question. I think you have to be very responsible, thinking about everything from scene selection to shot selection. My guiding principle with the film is that it could never serve as a recruiting tool for the movement. And I don't think it can. I mean, it's very clear watching this film, that these ideas are going mainstream, but especially as you get to Act 2 and Act 3, that this is a group of lost souls, deeply narcissistic, confused individuals who found community in a misguided and violent ideology. And, when you finish this film, you say, these are deluded people, these are dangerous people, but you definitely don't say, I want to join that movement. And I think, it's actually a tactical choice on my part, is to really kind of take their power away. I think if you're, and I'll try to keep it brief because I have a lot more. If you're doing it in a traditional way, which is a one-on-one sit-down interview, and that's kind of the basic journalistic understanding that we should challenge them, it doesn't work because they cut it up, they put it on their YouTube channel, and it becomes Mike Cernovich destroys mainstream media. He's going to I've seen him do it in front of my eyes, and it will rack up views. It'll be, wow, Mike destroyed that liberal commentator on the BBC or on NPR. with this, their defense, there's nothing they can do because it's all access, and it ultimately just displays how depressive and empty they are. And I think there was another question what they thought. They all despised the film for that reason, because it does strip them of the power of their public persona, these larger than life individuals. It shows how empty they are. And Lauren hates the film. I can't say much beyond that, but she's made my life basically a living hell since the film has come out. And I wrote an article about her that she's especially upset about. Cernovich does not like the film. Importantly, Cernovich's wife did like the film, which is kind of an interesting thing. She DM'd me on Instagram and said Mike didn't like it, but it was okay. I thought it was okay. And Richard Spencer, I have not heard from. But the movement in general does not like it. They've been trolling me aggressively since it came out for that exact reason. Is it just makes them look pretty bad in the end. But there's a lot of ways to get this kind of coverage wrong, and it has been done again and again and again.
And Daniel, you also mentioned, I think, in the film that you specifically identified those people who already had a lot of publicity. So you didn't want to give them more publicity because these were people who already had millions of followers.
Exactly. And we intentionally downplayed figures who are not famous. So Lucian Wintrich is kind of a secondary character in the film. Originally, we thought maybe he's mainstream, and we realized that we would be giving him the legitimacy of The Atlantic. We instead made him a secondary character. The three figures in the film at the time of conception were the three most influential people. Whether we paid attention to them or not, they were already, shaping the public conversation.
This one is to Linda and Daniel. What do you make of the two of the three subjects in the movie marrying people of color?
Linda,
I mean, I wanted a whole separate movie just on that topic, I gotta say. But Daniel, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
I don't know. It's hard to find an answer for it. Lauren is the most baffling. There's this, really important moment at the end of the film. I'm sorry if someone hasn't watched yet, where you find out that she ends up with a non-white partner. He is Filipino. He lives in Australia. She doesn't see any contradiction between being a woman who's fighting for the preservation of the white race. She sees herself as a woman, as having, a fundamental role in having white children. There's, in all nationalist movements, the women have a very important role in the domestic sphere to be baby makers, right? To protect the white demographic majority. For 84 minutes of the film at that point, you've seen her spout these talking points, and then you find out that she ends up with a non-white partner. She's since had a kid with that partner. She lives in Australia with him now, where he's originally from. There's no answer other than that it's a glaring contradiction, one that she refuses to see. And it's one of the reasons why she hates the film, because it really puts a spotlight on that. And in my commentary around the film, I've talked about it pretty openly being a contradiction. And to this day, she doesn't see how being a public racist is at all at odds with having multiracial kids and ending up with a Filipino. But I think it speaks to the point, and Mike is the same here, that all people are willing to make exceptions for those that they like. I mean, they despise Jews as much as anyone. Jews are the meddlers who are secretly controlling everything. And yet they made an exception for me. I mean, why was I invited to all of these events? I can't tell you, other than that they just came to like me as an individual in the way that Lauren came to like her spouse as a person too. I mean, there's nothing more to it than that in my view. Yeah.
This one you may have answered some, but there's some nuances here that I think would be good to address. I felt some discomfort in watching and feeling the closeness to the three leaders. Surely this is an issue not for just Daniel Lombroso, but for any embedded journalist in a war. While the contradictions in the three were cleverly and convincingly portrayed, I worry they may attract more sympathy rather than mobilize resistance.
Yeah, I think it goes to my previous answer, which is that everyone wants to join something that's powerful, that's on the rise. And the film certainly starts that way. And it's important that it starts that way. It's important to basically give them enough rope to hang themselves later in the film. It's important to show how widespread this stuff is, that it's just as pervasive in New York and DC as it is in Alabama or Birmingham or all of these places that we associate it with, right? The premise of all the work I do is to shine a light on difficult issues. And I have sort of an old school understanding of journalism in that, it's the view to document very carefully and to try to get at the truth and to present it. like I said before, I'm sorry if I'm redundant, I don't think the film could be a recruiting tool. I've screened for many conservative audiences, for many liberal audiences. It's been basically a uniform consensus that these guys look like terrible losers. And that they're in it for all the wrong reasons, for fame, for money. I feel very, very strongly that the film does not benefit them in any way, and that it's an important historical document. The people who ask that question typically are people on the left, and they're concerned, rightfully concerned. But many of the conservatives we've screened with have not felt sympathetic at all. If anything, they've finally understood that this is a terrible issue that they have to kick out of the conservative movement once and for all.
Okay,
Sam,
yeah, go ahead, please. Please.
To the question about how to discuss and talk about these folks without sort of glamorizing them, we struggled with that a little bit in dealing again with the things around Islamberg, partially because law enforcement had asked us not to go public because they were concerned that this would inspire copycats. And of course, they have more information than we do, things that are public and that are private, that they would have access to, that we didn't. We really, really trusted and tried to follow that advice. That said, it was like snatching the Band-Aid off, where we needed to expose them and be public with it, with the hope that, how they say, if you swing, you better hit. It was the same thing. We swung and we needed to hit, because we weren't just going to say that we're being victimized. We needed to be able to say, oh no, you're not. And we will make an example out of you. And I think that in that case, that's what's really led to people backing off a little bit on Islamberg, because we'll sue you and you're going to spend a lot of money, or we will nag the FBI and local law enforcement to pursue you and you will go to jail. So after a while, I think they just really felt like not as interesting anymore. Again, I'm not saying that we're free and clear, but I'm saying you swing, you hit. And fortunately, and I'm religious and I'm a person of faith, God was with us to give us strength where we didn't have it, and to let us hit when we didn't know if we had the power to reach.
Thank you. This one says for Daniel, but I can imagine any of you answering it. Also a Holocaust family background. I do a lot of reading about white supremacy, fascism, etc. It's my understanding that anti-Semitism, long rooted in Christian ideology, was a template and underpinning for racist ideologies overall. You don't mention religion or religious beliefs in your film, and I wonder if you think white supremacy among younger people is still defined by Christian values.
The group is not explicitly religious. Many of the people I've met are secular. That being said, they see Christianity as sort of a unifying principle. Basically, it's a way, they call themselves cultural Christians, which seems weird. And it's really a way for them to exclude Jews and Muslims. It's a way to say, I'm European except for Jews on the European continent, or Muslims from Bosnia or France or Albania or all these other places where Islam is present. So they use Christianity as an organizing principle. I think a lot of their myths around Jews are inherited from old anti-Semitism, from medieval anti-Semitism. And the most explicit way I think you see that is with QAnon, the new kind of iteration of the alt-right. It claims that there's basically a modern blood libel, which is from the Middle Ages, that Jews and elites, which is usually a euphemism, are running a pedophilia ring, which is very similar to the blood libel that Jews were drinking the blood of Christians and Christian children. So, I think they're always appropriating the past with everything in racist movements. I think to one of the first questions on the panel, this is really a repackaging of age-old hatreds. And of course, when you do that, anti-Semitism is a big part of it.
Any other thoughts on that one? No? Okay. I think that identification of prevention and treatment approaches will be most effective by ex-alt writers, which is the case for substance use treatment, i.e. you need to have been here to understand it. What are your thoughts? Anyone?
Jump in on that. I think that people who have gone through any life experience can be particularly useful and potentially persuasive for people who are contending with similar issues. I think that makes a lot of sense, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's exclusive. I think actually Daniel's in some ways a kind of a testament to this, right? Like I think by his own honesty and, you know, humble presence, I would suspect people felt comfortable talking with him and, you know, made him perhaps an exception to the rule as, you know, as far as his Jewish identity goes, but at least, you know, they now have some experience of a Jewish person who they did not see as an overt threat, at least until perhaps they saw the film. But this also makes me think about some recent work on what's called deep canvassing that's been used by a lot of organizations, especially, you know, if you think about trying to garner support for LGBT rights or, you know, trans rights, that like door-to-door canvassing and just having people not necessarily telling them your story, but giving them a chance to share their views and why they think what they think, and just having those humanizing moments of connection, I think can play a really important role. And so I definitely do think that recognizing, you know, from someone who's been in it, recognizing that shared experience can be motivating, but I wouldn't want to limit ourselves to that. I think actually many of us have roles to play in shaping people's attitudes and shifting people to think differently just by virtue of listening and responding to what they actually have to say.
This is also for any panelist. What's the funding for the alt-right?
Could say briefly, it's a lot of crowdfunding. You know, it's become harder for them to organize. Starting about 2 years ago, in 2018, Patreon, which is one of the largest crowdfunding websites, kicked off a lot of these individuals, including Richard and Lauren. They always find alternative ways. A lot of them are using cryptocurrency. So Bitcoin is actually Bitcoin was big on the far right way before it became big about a year ago here. And, you know, all of them have really kind of innovative ways of raising money. It's less, you know, checking the envelope stuff and more, you know, big crowdfunding campaigns online, a lot of small donations, which I think is terrifying. It's, you know, hundreds of small donations, but also big patrons. I mean, there was I spent some time trying to investigate, maybe there was a big wealthy family behind. There was never a direct link to anyone, but the Mercer family did fund, you know, Breitbart and a lot of kind of more moderate, slightly more moderate far right elements. You know, there's Sheldon, there's a lot of individuals kind of on the right who fund them. These far right figures are so toxic for your brand that it's very difficult for a CEO or for a philanthropist to touch them. So usually they'll do them through intermediaries. And I think the biggest suspect is Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal. He's thrown a lot of money towards far right causes. I was never able to find any evidence, and I don't think anyone else was, that he funded them directly, but he gives money to intermediaries who then give money to these groups. And you find a lot of people, I guess the bottom line, in Silicon Valley, in tech and in gaming, who are sympathetic to these issues and who, you know, kind of obliquely give money to these causes.
So it looks like 8:27. There's so many questions. They're all so wonderful. Okay, so one of the things mentioned in the movie that seems to perpetuate white identity building is the cancel culture attributed to the left, which at times has led to splintering and shaming. How do we on the left address cancel culture, and how do we aim to challenge internalized racism and other isms without shaming each other and causing separation rather than unity?
May I? I think about this idea about people who are woke, and I remember seeing a meme saying that said, "Is there room in our world, not just for the woke, but for the people who are still awakening," or something like that? And whatever, I probably said it wrong, but anyway, I like the idea that we need to remember that we are evolving, that we are learning, that this work isn't just, and this knowledge isn't intuitive. You don't just wake up and be woke. And that we have to be kind, generous, and patient with ourselves and with each other. We have to acknowledge, and I know that I'm repeating myself, that a lot of information and education has been suppressed and robbed from us. There is a reason that we do not know certain things about our history, and that is because there has been a concerted effort for 400 years to keep that information from us. And so as we're becoming aware, as historians are getting funded to do important research and dedicating their lives looking up materials that have been kept hidden, put in someone's attic, and now in 2020 and 2021, they're coming to life. We have to support their work, amplify their work, learn, study, share, and not shame. Like, bottom line, you can't shame. I'll use one example, and I know we're about to wrap up, but I think about Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a perfect example of the woke people being like, oh, I know Juneteenth. Everybody knows Juneteenth. I did not know Juneteenth. Juneteenth was not a significant thing in my family. I never heard my grandparents, who are Black Christian American, ever talk about Juneteenth. I have 11 aunts and uncles, never heard them speak about it. But it's sudden this year, it became, if you don't know what Juneteenth is, then you're out of it. And I'm not here for that. Some things and some information you just don't have access to for a whole host of reasons. You know what? We can learn about Juneteenth together. In all honesty, I knew about Juneteenth probably for a few years, but never truly knew about the history of it until I sat myself down and forced myself to just figure it out. But again, we have to be kind, patient, non-judgmental, but also persistent and hold high expectations of ourselves and others to avail ourselves of information.
Thank you. I am acknowledging the wonderful questions that are in this chat that we cannot answer. So thank you for all of these amazing questions, and for everyone for contributing and for answering them so thoroughly and so well. I'd like to turn it now to Devorah Jacobson, who's going to bring us to a close. And again, thank you for all of this discussion. Has been really excellent. You're muted, Devorah.
The fact that it's been an hour and a half and there are 77 of us still here, still eager to learn, with lots of questions on our plate, I think is an enormous statement. This has been an absolutely rich and compelling program. And on behalf of all of us at Critical Connections, we are enormously grateful to especially you, our three speakers, Daniel, Linda, and Tahirah. We are grateful to all of the various co-sponsors of tonight's program, as well as all who have joined us tonight. If you haven't had a chance to watch the film, as was mentioned earlier, it will be accessible for one more day. You can find it on the Critical Connections website, and you will find a link there to White Noise. In addition, we would love to encourage everyone to get on the Critical Connections website so you can learn more about the work this organization is doing. And you can also consider donating so that we can continue to bring about more programs like this one that we've had and enjoyed this evening. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.